She was just a kid in row 9, quiet, invisible, forgotten by everyone. Then the captain's voice cracked over the speakers, "Ghost, we need you now." Nobody knew her secret. Nobody knew what she carried. In the next 60 seconds, this 12-year-old girl would save every single life on board. Before we get into how we got here, comment where you're watching from, and hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you won't want to miss. A 12-year-old girl in a window seat just saved 218 people at 35,000 feet. Nobody on that plane knew her name until the moment they needed it. Before we get into how this happened, drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from right now. And if stories like this hit you right in the chest, hit subscribe, because there's more where this came from. Now let's go back to the beginning. Rosa Delgado hated flying alone, but she was getting used to it. 12 years old, 5 feet nothing, with a purple backpack covered in patches from every state her father had ever been stationed in. She moved through Charlotte Douglas International Airport the way she moved through everything else in her life, quietly, carefully, watching more than she talked. The gate agent at B-14 gave her the practiced smile that adults give to unaccompanied minors, the one that says "Don't worry, we've got you," even when they don't really know what that means. "First time flying by yourself, sweetheart?" "No, ma'am. I fly a lot." The agent laughed a little, charmed, and clipped a bright green tag to Rosa's backpack strap. "Unaccompanied minor," it read, in letters too big for a girl who didn't want to be noticed. "Well, you'll be in good hands. We'll have someone check on you the whole flight." Rosa nodded and said thank you, because her mother had raised her to always say thank you, and boarded early with the families and the elderly and the other kids traveling alone. She found her seat, 9F, a window seat near the wing, and settled in before anyone else in her row arrived. She pulled a paperback from her bag. Not a novel. A field manual, its cover soft and rounded from being carried in and out of backpacks for 2 years straight. Aircraft Systems and Emergency Response, the kind of book you don't find in a school library. The man who sat down next to her, a salesman in his 50s with a laptop bag and tired eyes, glanced at the cover and raised an eyebrow but said nothing. People rarely said anything to Rosa about the things she carried. They just filed her under strange kid and moved on with their day. A flight attendant named Priya stopped at the row during boarding, crouching slightly so she was eye level with Rosa. "Hi there. I'm Priya, I'll be up and down the aisle the whole flight, okay? You need anything, you just wave." "Thank you," Rosa said. "What are you reading?" Priya tilted her head at the book. "Just something about planes. I like aviation." "Well, you picked the right seat then." Priya smiled and moved on down the aisle, checking seatbelts, counting heads, running through the same choreography she ran through 5 times a day, every day, on autopilot the way flight attendants do after a decade in the sky. What Priya didn't know, what nobody on that aircraft knew, was that Rosa wasn't reading about planes out of curiosity. She was reading because her mother had made her memorize every page of that manual, cover to cover, twice a week, for 2 years. Her mother had been a name once. Not a famous one, not outside the tight little world of test pilots and flight engineers, but inside that world, Lieutenant Commander Elena Delgado had been something close to a legend. She'd spent 11 years testing aircraft systems that hadn't been cleared for production yet, pushing hydraulics and electrical architecture to their breaking points in simulators and then, when the simulators weren't enough, in the air. She had a gift for finding the failure nobody else could find, and then, worse and better, finding the fix nobody else could find either. She called her daughter Sparrow. Nobody remembered exactly why, some joke from Rosa's toddler years about how she used to hop instead of walk, but the name had stuck through a decade of bedtime stories that weren't really bedtime stories at all. They were lessons dressed up as bonding time. Emergency checklists recited like nursery rhymes. Diagrams of hydraulic systems drawn on napkins at the kitchen table while dinner got cold. "Why do I need to know this, Mom?" Rosa had asked once, 8 years old and frustrated, after getting a sequence wrong for the 4th time in a row. I'm not gonna be a pilot. Elena had set down her coffee and looked at her daughter with the kind of seriousness most parents save for talks about drugs or strangers. Sparrow, listen to me. I've spent 11 years finding things out that aren't written down anywhere. Fixes I came up with in the middle of a bad flight that never made it into any manual because there wasn't time, or because the higher-ups didn't think a fix that broke 3 rules could possibly be a good fix. If something happens to me, all of that just disappears. Unless somebody remembers it. You're smart enough. You're stubborn enough. So you're going to remember it. Not because you'll ever need it. Because somebody might. 14 months ago, Elena Delgado's test aircraft had gone down during a routine evaluation flight over open water. The report used words like undetermined mechanical anomaly and pilot performed admirably under the circumstances. What it meant, in the end, was that Rosa's mother wasn't coming home. The box of personal effects had included a folded flight suit patch, a set of dog tags, and a sealed envelope with one word on the front, Sparrow. If you're reading this, I didn't make it back. I need you to promise me something, don't let what I taught you go to waste. Somebody, somewhere, someday, is going to need it more than you ever will. Be ready. Don't be afraid to be the one who knows. I love you more than you'll understand until you have a kid of your own someday. Mom. Rosa kept that letter folded inside the manual's back cover. She touched it now, through the canvas of her backpack, as the aircraft pushed back from the gate and began its long taxi to the runway. Up front, in a cockpit that felt roomy compared to anything Elena Delgado had ever flown, Captain Marcus Webb ran through his pre-departure checklist with First Officer Aaliyah Chen. Webb was 51, 26 years into a commercial career that had started, like a lot of commercial careers, in military cockpits. He'd flown transports, not fighters, big, slow, unglamorous aircraft that nonetheless demanded the same discipline as anything faster. He liked commercial flying because it was, on a good day, boring. Boring meant everyone got where they were going. Webb kept an old photograph tucked into his flight bag, curling at the corners. A squadron photo from a joint exercise almost 15 years back, a dozen young officers squinting into desert sun, and in the second row, arms crossed, unmistakable grin on her face, was Elena Delgado. She'd been attached to his unit for 6 weeks as a systems liaison, and during a training flight gone sideways, an electrical fault that cascaded faster than anyone in the aircraft could diagnose, she'd talked his crew through a fix over the radio that wasn't in any handbook Webb had ever seen before or since. He never forgot a debt like that. He'd heard about her accident 14 months ago through the kind of grapevine that connects people who've spent their lives in cockpits. He'd sent a card to an address he wasn't even sure was still current. He remembered, vaguely, that she had a daughter. A little girl who used to draw airplanes on the backs of napkins, according to a story Elena had told once, laughing, in a crew lounge years ago. He didn't think about any of that as he scanned the passenger manifest on his tablet before pushback, a habit, nothing more, a captain's eyes running down a list of names that meant nothing to him. Until one did. R. Delgado, Seat 9F, unaccompanied minor. Webb's hand paused over the screen. Delgado wasn't an uncommon name. It was probably nothing. But something in his chest tightened anyway, and he made a mental note, have Priya check on the kid, maybe say something kind, maybe not, it was probably nothing, before turning back to the checklist and the business of getting 218 people into the sky. The climb was smooth. The seatbelt sign came off. Somewhere around 31,000 feet, First Officer Chen commented on the clear skies, the kind of easy, weightless remark pilots make when a flight is going exactly the way it's supposed to. Let's keep it that way, Webb said. And then, 12 minutes later, a small amber light blinked on in the corner of the hydraulic display. Blinked, and steadied. Webb tapped the panel out of habit, the way you'd tap an old television. Probably a sensor fault. These aircraft had backups on their backups. Then a second light, electrical, secondary bus. Then a third. "Captain, I've got a caution on backup hydraulics too," Chen said, her voice tightening at the edges. "I see it. Pull the checklist." They worked through it the way they'd trained to, calm hands, clipped voices, the particular choreography of two professionals trying not to let each other see how fast their hearts were beating. But the lights kept multiplying instead of clearing. Pressure dropping on System 2. Flight control computer reporting degraded authority, backup pump output fluctuating in a pattern that made no engineering sense, because these systems were supposed to be independent of one another. "This isn't matching any failure mode I've trained for," Chen said. "They're not supposed to cascade like this." Webb disengaged the autopilot and took the controls by hand. The yoke felt heavy and vague under his fingers, like steering a car through deep mud. He could feel the aircraft wanting to drift, feel the airplane's responsiveness bleeding away in real time. "Declare an emergency," he said. "Get us vectors to the nearest field." Chen's voice on the radio was steady in a way her hands weren't. "Center, this is Flight 1704 declaring an emergency. Multiple system failures, requesting immediate vectors and priority handling." 1704, Roger, understand emergency declared. Nearest suitable is Nashville, bearing 310, 140 miles. 140 miles. Webb did the math without wanting to. At the rate these systems were degrading, he wasn't sure they'd hold together for 40. He tried everything training had ever given him. Backup pump engaged, pressure kept sliding. Emergency electrical bus brought online, the degradation continued anyway, as if the fix itself were somehow feeding the failure. Manual trim barely answered his inputs at all. It was like watching an old friend slowly stop breathing and not being able to find the reason why. And then something in the back of Webb's memory clicked into place. This exact rhythm of failure, hydraulic and electrical dying together in a feedback loop that violated everything the engineers said should be impossible, he had felt this before. 15 years ago, in a different aircraft, in a different sky, with Elena Delgado's voice in his headset walking him through a fix that shouldn't have worked and did. She'd called it something. He'd forgotten the name, if she'd ever given it one. He remembered the shape of the solution, not the steps. And getting the steps wrong at 31,000 feet with 218 people behind him wasn't an option. If only she were here. If only he could ask her. And then his eyes fell, almost by accident, back to the tablet resting in its cradle. To the manifest still glowing faintly on the screen. R. Delgado, Seat 9F. It was insane. It was a coincidence, probably, a common enough surname, and even if it wasn't a coincidence, she was a child, 12, maybe 13 years old. But Elena had talked, once, about teaching her daughter things. About a kid who could recite hydraulic diagrams the way other kids recited song lyrics. And Elena had given her a name, hadn't she, some pilot's habit of putting a call sign on the people she loved most. Webb's hand was shaking as he reached for the intercom. "This is Captain Webb," he said, his voice raw in a way 26 years of training hadn't prepared him for. "Passenger Delgado, Seat 9F, if you can hear me, I flew with your mother." He hesitated, half convinced he was about to sound like a lunatic to 218 frightened strangers. Then he said it anyway. "Sparrow. We need you. Please, come forward. Now." In row 9, the manual slid off Rosa's lap. She had been reading, rereading, really, a page about backup electrical routing she already had memorized, when her own name came out of the cabin speakers, followed by a word she hadn't heard spoken aloud in 14 months. A word that belonged only to her mother's voice, in a kitchen, at a napkin covered in diagrams, at a hospital bed she never got to visit because there hadn't been a hospital bed, only an ocean and a search that ended too fast. Sparrow. The salesman next to her startled at the sudden authority in the captain's voice. 2 rows up, an elderly woman gripped her armrests. The whole cabin had gone still in that particular way a cabin goes still when something is wrong and nobody has been told exactly what yet. Rosa's hands were trembling, but her mind wasn't. She could hear her mother's voice as clearly as if she were sitting beside her. When somebody calls for you, you go. That's the whole job, Sparrow. You go. She unbuckled her seatbelt. Honey, I think you should stay seated, the salesman said, half reaching for her arm, more confused than anything. That's me, Rosa said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. He needs me. She stepped into the aisle. Priya was already hurrying back from the front, alarm plain on her face, clearly trying to figure out whether the captain had lost his mind or whether there was something happening she didn't understand yet. Sweetheart, you need to sit back down, I have to check with the... I'm Delgado, Rosa said. My mom was a test pilot. Elena Delgado. The captain knew her. He needs me in the cockpit right now, and if you don't let me through, people might die. Please. Priya stared at this small girl standing in the aisle of a shaking aircraft, and something in the girl's eyes, a stillness that had no business existing in a child's face, made her turn without another word and grab the interphone. Captain, I have a passenger here, she says she's Delgado, she says. Send her up. Now. Webb's voice cracked through the line. Priya took Rosa's hand and walked her forward through a cabin full of frightened strangers who were beginning, without being told, to understand that whatever was happening to their airplane was serious, and that this small girl in a purple backpack was somehow part of the answer. The cockpit door opened. Captain Webb turned in his seat, and when he saw her, something in his face broke open, recognition, grief, a wild and desperate hope all crashing together at once. You look just like her, he said. Rosa stepped inside. Her eyes went straight to the instrument panel, scanning the pattern of failures the way her mother had trained her to scan a diagram, not reading each light individually, but reading the shape of the problem, the way the failures were talking to each other. You're getting hydraulic and electrical failures feeding each other, she said. That's not two separate problems. That's one problem pretending to be two. Standard checklists won't fix it because they assume the systems are independent, and right now they aren't. Webb felt something in his chest cave inward with relief and terror at once. You know this? My mom called it a cross-feed cascade. She figured it out the hard way, over water, a long time before I was born, before you flew with her, maybe. She made me learn it. She said someday somebody might need it. Rosa took a breath. Her mother's voice was steady in her memory, and she let it steady her own. Captain, I need you to trust me completely for the next few minutes. Can you do that? Tell me what to do. First, there's a manual isolation valve for the backup hydraulic pump. It's usually behind a guarded panel near the base of the center pedestal, not the primary control. You need to physically separate that pump from the main circuit. That breaks the loop that's feeding itself. Webb felt along the pedestal, fingers finding a small guarded lever he'd flown past 1,000 times and never once touched. He flipped the guard, turned the lever. The pressure gauge trembled and steadied, just slightly. First officer, Rosa said, turning to Chen, I need you to shed exactly 60% of the non-essential electrical load. Not 50, not 70. My mom found that number the hard way, anything else and the feedback comes right back. Start with the yellow guarded switches, the secondary bus systems. Chen's hands moved fast, flipping switches, watching cabin lighting dim as she stripped the electrical load down. 60%, how do you even know that number that precisely? Because I practiced it 50 times in a garage that smelled like motor oil, Rosa said, and for a second something like a smile flickered across her face before the seriousness returned. Captain, there's an emergency manual override for the secondary pump, usually a red handle behind the seat. Pull it down, but only about 3 inches, and hold. Too far and you'll overpressure the line. Webb reached back, found the handle exactly where she said it would be, and pulled it to the position she described, holding it steady with a hand that had stopped shaking somewhere in the last 90 seconds. The pressure gauge crept upward. 40%. 45. It's stabilizing, Chen breathed. It won't go back to full, Rosa warned. It's not supposed to. You're not trying to fix the airplane completely, you're trying to get it stable enough to fly with reduced authority. Gentle inputs from here. No sharp corrections. Webb felt the yoke respond under his hands, sluggish, diminished, but alive again in a way it hadn't been for the last agonizing 10 minutes. Now bring back electrical buses 3 and 5 only, Rosa continued. Together, not one at a time, that balance is what keeps the load from spiking again. Chen restored the buses exactly as instructed. The cascade of warning lights, which had been multiplying without mercy for what felt like an hour but had been closer to 15 minutes, finally began, one by one, to clear. Webb keyed the radio, his voice thick with something between exhaustion and disbelief. Center, 1704, systems have stabilized. Still declaring an emergency, still need priority, but we believe we can make Nashville. Copy, 1704. Cleared direct, descend at pilot's discretion. Emergency equipment will be standing by. Rosa stayed beside the captain's seat through the descent, calling out small warnings before Webb even registered the numbers himself. Approach speed 10 knots higher than standard, because reduced hydraulic pressure meant sluggish control response and the extra speed bought back the authority they'd lost. Shallow bank angles only. No aggressive corrections that might spike the feedback loop back to life. The runway lights came up through the windscreen 31 minutes later. Fire trucks lined the taxiway on both sides, red and white lights sweeping across a runway that, for one unbearable stretch of sky, nobody had been sure this aircraft would ever reach. The wheels touched down with a solid, ordinary thump, the most beautiful, unremarkable sound Marcus Webb had heard in his entire career. When the engines finally wound down on the taxiway, surrounded by emergency vehicles that, for once, had nothing to do, Webb turned in his seat and looked at the 12-year-old girl standing beside him. The composure that had carried her through the last half hour cracked all at once, and she was, suddenly, simply a child again, exhausted, shaking, blinking back tears she'd been holding at bay through sheer will. Webb pulled off his headset and wrapped his arms around her. Your mother just saved this airplane, he said, his own voice breaking. 15 years ago, and today. Both times, through you. She said the knowledge shouldn't die with her, Rosa said into his shoulder, her voice muffled and small. She made me promise I'd remember. I didn't know if I'd ever actually need it. You needed it today, Webb said. And you were ready. Aaliyah Chen put a hand on Rosa's shoulder, her professional composure finally slipping into something raw. You're a hero, kid. You know that? Rosa shook her head, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. I'm not the hero. I just remembered what she taught me. My mom's the hero. She's always been the hero. Outside the cockpit door, 218 passengers waited in a cabin gone strangely, reverently quiet, aware only that something had gone very wrong and then, impossibly, gone right again, and that somewhere at the front of the plane was the answer to how. When Webb led Rosa out to face them, arm resting lightly on her shoulder, the cabin didn't erupt right away. It simply watched, this small girl in a hoodie with a purple backpack still slung over one shoulder, dog tags she'd taken to wearing under her shirt just visible at her collar. Ladies and gentlemen, Webb said, his voice carrying the particular gravity of a man who had, 20 minutes earlier, genuinely believed he might not get the chance to say anything else to anyone. We experienced a serious multiple system failure today. One that our standard procedures were not built to handle. We are on the ground, and every one of you is safe, because of her. He looked down at Rosa. This is Rosa Delgado. Her mother was a test pilot who spent her career finding fixes that saved lives, fixes that existed nowhere except in the people she taught them to. Today, her daughter remembered one of those fixes, and she saved every person on this aircraft. For a long beat, nobody moved. Then someone in row 4 began to clap, and it spread through the cabin the way relief spreads, fast, and total, and full of tears nobody had expected to cry on a Tuesday afternoon flight to Nashville. The salesman from seat 90 found her in the crowd afterward, his eyes red. "I sat next to you the whole flight," he said. "I thought you were just a kid with a weird book." "I get that a lot," Rosa said, and for the first time in 14 months, something that was almost a real smile reached her eyes. The investigation that followed took the better part of 2 months. Engineers picked apart the aircraft's systems down to individual wiring runs, trying to understand a failure cascade so rare it had only ever been documented once before, a decade and a half earlier, in a test aircraft flown by a young officer named Elena Delgado, in an incident that had never made it past a classified internal report because, at the time, nobody outside a small circle of test pilots had believed it could happen twice. It happened twice. The final report didn't just close the file. It recommended that the fix, logged officially now as the Delgado cross-feed procedure, be incorporated into emergency training for every commercial pilot flying that aircraft type. A woman's private knowledge, carried for over a decade in a manual only she and, eventually, her daughter had ever fully understood, was now going to live in checklists on flight decks around the world. At a press conference 2 weeks later, reporters crowded a stuffy hotel ballroom, cameras trained on a captain and a 7th grader who looked deeply uncomfortable at the size of the room. "I want to be honest about something," Webb told them. "We were out of options. I was 30 seconds from telling 218 people that I didn't know how this ended. And then I remembered that Elena Delgado's daughter was on my flight, and I made a call that I had no right to expect would work." Rosa answered it. "She's the reason everyone on that aircraft is going home to their families." When it was her turn at the microphone, Rosa was quiet for a moment, gathering the kind of courage that has nothing to do with cockpits. "My mom used to say that knowledge shouldn't die just because a person does," she said finally. "She said that if somebody figures out a way to save a life and it disappears when they do, then somewhere down the road somebody else pays for that loss. She didn't want that. So she taught me. Not because she knew I'd ever need it. Just because she believed it mattered too much to let it disappear." She looked up, into the cameras, into all the strangers watching. "I'm not a pilot. I'm just a kid. But I could remember. And when somebody called for me, I answered. That's what she asked of me. That's what I did." Months later, at a small ceremony that made no headlines and needed none, Rosa stood in a hangar holding a set of worn aviator's wings that Captain Webb had carried in his own kit for 15 years, waiting, though he hadn't known it at the time, for someone who deserved them more than he did. "She gave these to me after that flight over the water," he told her. "She said, keep them until you meet somebody who's earned them more than I have." I didn't understand what she meant for a long, long time. He pressed the wings into her hand. "I understand now." Rosa closed her fingers around the metal, worn smooth by years she'd never gotten to witness, and thought about a kitchen table covered in napkin diagrams, a garage that smelled like motor oil, a woman who believed that what she knew mattered too much to let it die quietly with her. "I remembered, Mom," she thought. "I was ready. I hope I made you proud." Somewhere, she was certain, the answer was yes. Rosa went back to school the following week, and for the first time in her life, invisibility wasn't an option anymore. Kids who had never spoken to her crowded around her lunch table asking if it was true, if she'd really walked into a cockpit, if the plane had really almost gone down. She answered as honestly as she could, though the honest answer, "I don't know how I did it, I just did what I was taught," never seemed to satisfy anyone looking for a movie ending. Her science teacher, a soft-spoken man named Mr. Ibrahim who had spent 30 years trying to convince distracted 12-year-olds that physics was interesting, asked her to stay after class one afternoon. "I heard what happened," he said. "I wanted to ask, do you want to talk about the systems? The actual engineering of it? Not for a grade. Just because I think you might be the only person in this building who'd actually enjoy the conversation." Rosa hesitated, then nodded, and for the next hour they filled a whiteboard with diagrams of hydraulic architecture and feedback loops, and for the first time since the accident, Rosa found herself talking about her mother's work with something other than grief sitting on top of it. There was pride there too, now, sitting right alongside the loss, the two of them learning to share the same space. "Your mother sounds like she was remarkable," Mr. Ibrahim said, capping the marker. "She was," Rosa said. "I used to think she was just being strict, making me learn all that stuff. Now I think she was trying to make sure a piece of her would always be useful. Even after." "And it was." "Yeah," Rosa said, looking at the tangle of arrows and boxes on the whiteboard, a map of exactly what had saved 218 lives on an ordinary Tuesday. "It was." A year later, Captain Webb invited her to the airline's training center, a sprawling building full of full-motion simulators that could recreate any storm, any malfunction, any nightmare scenario a pilot might one day face for real. He walked her through a corridor lined with classrooms, and in one of them, 30 pilots in training stood when she walked in, an instinctive, unplanned gesture of respect that made Rosa's face go red with embarrassment. "These are pilots who've spent the last few months studying the Delgado procedure," Webb told her. "Because of what you remembered on that flight, all of them now know how to handle a failure that used to be considered unsurvivable. You didn't just save the people on our aircraft that day. You've already saved people who don't even know yet that they needed saving." One by one, they came forward to shake her hand. A woman near the back, a first officer with 3 young kids of her own, held on to Rosa's hand a moment longer than the rest. "If I ever face what your captain faced," she said quietly, "my kids get to keep their mother. Because of you, because of her." She didn't need to say who her was. Everyone in the room already understood. Afterward, Webb let her sit in one of the simulators, walking her through the basics, how to read the instruments, how to feel out the sluggish, honest weight of an aircraft responding to her hands. It wasn't the real thing, but it was close enough that Rosa understood, for the first time, exactly why her mother had never been able to stop talking about the sky. "You have her hands," Webb said, watching her ease the simulated aircraft through a gentle turn. "Same instinct. Same calm." "I miss her," Rosa said simply. "I know," Webb said. "But she's not gone the way you think she is. Not really. Not as long as you keep doing exactly what you're doing." 5 years later, Rosa Delgado stood at a podium at a National Aviation Safety Conference, no longer a child in a hoodie but a high school senior with an early acceptance letter to an aerospace engineering program folded in her bag, waiting to be shared with the room once the speech was over. "I used to think my mother taught me all those procedures because she wanted me to be exceptional," she told the audience of pilots, engineers, and safety officials. "I understand now that she taught me because she refused to believe that knowledge should die quietly with the person who earned it. She thought that was a kind of waste the world couldn't afford. And I think about all of you, sitting in this room, carrying things in your heads that nobody else has ever written down. A fix you found under pressure. A pattern you noticed that saved a flight nobody ever heard about. I'm asking you, write it down. Teach it to someone. Don't let it disappear with you. Because somewhere, someday, in a seat nobody's paying attention to, there might be another kid with a backpack who's going to need exactly what you know." The applause that followed lasted longer than she expected, and somewhere in the middle of it, Rosa closed her eyes and let herself believe, just for a moment, that her mother could hear it too.